So 21st lecture, grading is the same. The assignments become the exam. So questions from the class. What can cause liver function not to, or liver not to function correctly? A lot of things. It can get overwhelmed with toxins in some way. It can be damaged. There can be cancer. There's lots of different things that can be there. The one we'll talk most about is ketosis and fatty liver. There's so much fat in the liver that the liver can't function the way it used to anymore. So you've got all kinds of things out of balance, especially from a hydrophobic, hydrophilic balance. So how have you tested on heart function in the past? I've done a range of things, just basically giving you a blank sheet. I've given the diagram that I asked you to learn and told you to explain it. I've asked you to put things in order in some way, shape, or form, give a list of events, put them in order. I've broken things up. What are the electrical events? What are the pressure events? When do the valves open and close? Any preferences on those? So there was a lot of moving toward, the preference in the class is moving toward some sort of fill in the blank. Either take a diagram, fill in those blanks, or figuring out what's next, fill in the blank. That way seems to be the preference of the class. What are the charges balanced outside the cell and in the blood? We could probably go over this as a thing there. People struggle with that. So we have inside the cell and anywhere generally outside. That can be blood, that can be interstitial. It's all the same from what we're talking about here, from a charge balance. So you're looking at, you're going to have a total in each location about 300 milliosmoles. So that is what? Anybody remember? Isotonic. So depending on whether the bicarb's there, then the bicarb's not there, that number will vary. It's not a perfect number. So you're going from anywhere from. So in the cell, as a rule, and outside the cell, the positive charges have to equal the negative charges. So what is the primary intracellular electrolyte? Most of the time, that's potassium, right? Intracellular cation, what's the primary outside? That's the negative charge. What's the positive? Sodium. We talked about somewhere around 100 to 145-ish. You got 150-ish there for a positive. So to balance things out, you got probably 5 in the other category. That's sodium that creeps in. All the other stuff you got out here, you've got probably, to make that balanced, 10 other. Potassium, calcium, magnesium, all there. So those are the positive. We have to have an equal number of negative charges. So what is the negative charge inside the cell? Where do the negative charges come from? Mostly protein. So looking at this diagram, potassium is going to be mostly balanced against protein. You're going to have bicarb in here as well. So outside the cell, you've got chloride for your negative and bicarb. It's going to be somewhere in that 20 range. It's going to be somewhere in that 90 range, and you're going to have a bunch of protein there as well. So at some point, these are going to add up to that 150-ish, 155, 155, 55, 155. So positives equal to negatives. And they both add up to isotonic. So you're in that 300 range. It's not perfect from a math standpoint, but if you focus on this is the main positive inside, that's balanced against the main negative inside. And then you've got these balanced with these on the outside. So you guys need to remember, unless you're on the vet school. Does that help clear up that question? So that diagram puts it very eloquently. You also have the table in the slide before that shows a little bit more of the numbers. So both of those columns approach 300 inside and outside isotonic. So does that clear up the homework and the questions related to that? Another thing on the homework, when is the AV valve open? Does anybody have an answer to that? AV valve, where's that located? So in between the atrium and the ventricle. So you got the valve here. So you all got when it shuts. When does it shut? Blood slams against it. When does that occur? When the ventricle starts to contract. So that's your first heart sound, right? That's going to stay closed as long as the pressure in the ventricle is greater than the atrium. When does the ventricle drop below the atrium? It will get there with that. The SL valve blows open. The pressure drops. Eventually, the SL valve will close. And then what? The AV valve opens because the pressure in here. So it's the beginning of diastole, not the beginning of systole. So the AV valve is open most of the time. At the beginning of diastole, the blood flows into both. Since we didn't have enough red blood cells, we couldn't do that. But blood flows in here, and as long as the pressure up here is greater, it's going to flow through that valve. So you've got passive filling during the rest phase, and that valves are open on both sides. Then you get the contraction, start of systole. That's going to keep that open until the AV node fires, starts contraction, and it shuts only for when the pressure is greater, and that's only during the ventral contraction phase. Does that help clear things up a little bit? How does calcium affect a DA? We talked about a theory. Again, it's not proven. When they've tried to study DAs, nobody's really figured it out. They do all the things that you'd expect to happen. Doesn't always happen. So we don't have a full understanding, but I presented two conditions that happen in early lactation, which is when most of the DAs occur. You've got an excess of VFA or acidosis and hypocalcemia. Hypocalcemia is going to take away that tone. That abomasum is going to get sloppy and it can start to move anywhere it wants. It can also fill up with gas and not contract and push the gas back into the rumen is another possibility as well. So it can't contract, loses tone, gets sloppy. That can contribute to it moving out of place. And then the last question, would you consider making the test smaller? I have in the past. We've had 5 tests or split up the remaining tests for the rest of the semester at the request of students. So I sent you, did anybody see that announcement in there? Have you had enough time to think about that? So if you're thinking about the announcements, that would look like we'd split the second and third exams into 2 parts. For the next exam, it would be the A part would be about calcium metabolism, muscle, cardiovascular, veins and arteries, and then a second half would be about blood, body, water, sick cows, lungs, and kidneys. So your choice is you can do all that this Thursday, or just do the first half, and then we'd have to find another time outside of class where you all can meet to take the second half of the exam. I'm guessing that might be a challenge. What are your thoughts on those 2 options? Do you care? Something you want? Oh, we got 2 heads shaking. Any discussion about those options? Anybody have anything they'd like to say about it?
When we be taking the second start like next week.
I would like it early next week, like Monday or Tuesday, outside of class. Any other questions or discussion before we put it to a vote?
There'd be more questions about like each one of those topics if like a small class.
I might go a little bit more into like sub questions to allow you to be more definitive. Whereas the single test tends to be a little bit broader. So might be a little bit more, but I think that could only help you. And they'd be the same questions on the homework. You know, how I ask a question and do sub questions on it to help walk you through the answer or whatever, to help you think about that. So it would be like that. Any other questions or discussion? So we've got 6 of you here. Go to 1 if you'd like to keep the things the way they are. Go to 2 if you prefer to change things and fold over your answer. So you got 1, keep things the way things are. 2 is splitting up. We might have for finals week, maybe we have something at the end of the last week of classes. And then another where I don't know, I don't think they put out final exam schedule. I approved it last week. I was like, yeah, but the schedule is fine to me. So I think it's coming out this Friday. Or we could do it the beginning and end of finals week as a split exam. So everybody got the vote they want. I'll collect those. We've got 4 for 2 and 2 for 1. I believe Ms. Ray would be in the 2 camp if she was here. So any real objections to doing it that way or not? When could we do a second exam? That's the real key to this. Yes, and Jonah would have problems getting here, right?
Yeah.
And you're leaving, so evenings are a challenge.
We have a gap on the weekend. Will you have come? Talk to me. I want to. This.
Not everybody has to be in the same location at the same time, but I like it to be given out like in a 2-hour block, if everybody could get there in that 2-hour block. That would be fine with me. I don't know if Joan is on campus.
Yeah, I won't be here.
When do you leave campus on Mondays?
Noon.
Could do it. Cause
You
we,
what, when?
at 12:30 or 12. Cause we don't have to go to like Fest next Wednesday.
You don't want to miss classes because of an exam. I don't want to get in trouble for it. It's not about you, it's about me.
Wednesday. It's probably best for me because I only have 2 classes and in between you have nothing.
So is everybody in here in reading or not?
Oh, now, yeah.
Not AI reading. 110. Cheryl, are you or not? Okay. What do you have at noon on Wednesdays?
Definitely, but I'm not here.
You don't come to campus on Wednesdays.
I have class until like 9:30, or like
Okay.
9:45, I think.
And then you're gone?
Yeah, we're done we're done with March's like 9:50
10 o'clock
Yeah.
on Tuesday,
Wednesday.
Wednesday? Is Ms. Ray in your reading class or not? She's got ag science, so she may not. So let's focus on Wednesday morning. Is that gonna be a trauma or not? Is there another test you guys are getting at that time or not? Are you getting your breeding exam next week or is
We
it
didn't have
tomorrow?
it.
Monday?
Yeah, we just had it.
Okay. Okay, so that won't interfere. Is everybody okay with that? Speak now or forever hold your peace. That's split.
Wednesday after, 10 o'clock, like.
Yeah, somewhere in there. I'm up. It'll probably be in 203 up here. I have class at 11. You can come here and stay. We get here at 10. You can stay as long as you want. I don't have anything till 1 o'clock on next. I don't think I have anything next Wednesday afternoon. I got a meeting at 1 o'clock this week. Okay, we'll give it a try, see if you like it. Would you prefer the hour-and-a-half exam or 2 shorter exams? So we're gonna try the 2 shorter exams and see if that works. So until I get it posted, it's about calcium metabolism, muscles, cardiovascular, arteries and veins. And then the other one will be next week. You get the blood, body, water, sick cows, and kidneys. That'll also give you some time to the homework assignment. If I can get that back to you on Tuesday, you can get some feedback on that as well. Okay, I'll try to get that posted this afternoon, but Tuesdays can be pretty busy. So we're focusing on metabolism, figuring things out. Save those for next week. Let's spend some time on metabolism today. Let's see what you remember from last time. So I want to take glucose, a carbohydrate, convert it to carbon dioxide and water in an animal cell. What are the steps? So what steps does a carbohydrate go through? Anybody want to shout that out or turn to a neighbor and figure it out? What did we say last time? So what's up there? What does G stand for? What does T stand for? Transition. What does F stand for? Fat prep. P is for protein prep. O is for oxidation. So where does a carbohydrate come in? Carbohydrates come in on the top up here. Where's everything turned to CO2 and water? Oxidation. We need 2 carbon units going in that fire, and they should be burned completely to CO2 and water. So to get from G to O, what do we have to do? GTO is the sequence. What about a protein? What does that go through? Okay, so 3 different routes depending on the amino acid. So the first thing with protein is we do what? Split it into amino acids. Then the next step is what? Pull the ammonia off. We can't burn ammonia, so we got to get rid of that. And whatever's left, the keto acid is called what it's called, but whatever that backbone that's left is, we drew it last time. Our amino acid. We cut that off, whatever's left over goes possibly 3 different paths. So what is the simplest one? PO, that glycine will go through that pathway. What is the most complicated one? PGTO and the one in the middle. PTO, power takeoff. Protein prep, transition, oxidation. Fat. What happens with fat? Triglycerides first. So we take the top off the triglyceride, we got 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. Where's the glycerol go? Glycolysis, transition, oxidation. So FGTO. Where does fat go? Or the fatty acids go? Chop them into 2 pieces as part of fat prep, and they go directly to oxidation. They skip over transition. When that fails, that's when ketosis occurs. So we've done all 3 of those. So one of the things before we jump into metabolism here is I want to talk about 3 carbon units. For this class, they are highly interchangeable. So why do we care about 3 carbon units? This is what the cow's liver uses to make glucose. So there are 5 different things that a cow's liver can use to make glucose. As you'll see as we go through this, they absorb very little. But we need that glucose to make lactose in the mammary gland. So we need those 3 carbon units to build glucose. So where could those 3 carbon units come from? So there's 5 that we'll talk about in this class. All can be used to make glucose, and they are similar enough that the liver can convert them to whatever they need to. They can be converted back and forth between the 5 different things there. So if we look at the 5 different ones, we have the stars on all 3 of these, or 5 of these. So we can use alanine, we can use glycerol, pyruvic acid, lactic acid, or propionic acid. The bulk of the sugar is made, glucose is made from these top 2. Propionic acid, probably more than lactic acid, but they are highly interchangeable in the body. So where does propionic acid come from? Anybody remember? What? The VFA, where's VFAs produced? In the rumen and fermentation. So all of the propionic acid that's formed gets absorbed, goes to the liver, used to make glucose. There's a whole lot of propionic acid going into the liver, very little coming out. All of it's scavenged by the liver and turned into glucose. Lactic acid, wherever that's produced, either in the rumen or the muscles, wherever, that can leave the cell, be absorbed, go to the liver will convert it into glucose again. So 1, 2, 3 carbons, 1, 2, 3 carbons. You take 2 of those, put them together, you got glucose. Pyruvic acid, where does that come from? Metabolism, specifically what part? This is the end of glycolysis. So especially lactic acid and pyruvic acid will be interchanged back and forth at the end of glycolysis. We'll talk more about that when we get to muscle metabolism. Glycerol, where's that come from?
The triglycerides.
Triglycerides. So we need glucose to make two glycerols, or we take two glycerols and we can make glucose. And then alanine is one of the non-essential amino acids. I laid it out here, 1, 2, 3 carbons, but are NCC. No, NCC this way, and then we've got a methane group off there. We pull the ammonia group off, the nitrogen off, and we can use it to make glucose. Or we can take any of those other three and make alanine by sticking one in there. So these other ones, these are acids. So we haven't given up the acid, we've given up the acid. For the proton, we haven't given up the proton, we've given up the proton. So lactic acid still has the proton, lactate is lost the proton. We tend to use these interchangeably, but they're at a chemical level different. Propionic acid versus propionate, with and without the hydrogen. So those three, all or five, 3 carbon units all have that 3 carbon backbone. They can be used to make glucose, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So gluconeogenesis is the reverse of glycolysis. We start out with glucose, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. 5 are in the ring, 1 sticking off. We split it in half, we get 2 3 carbon units. Normally in glycolysis, it's pyruvic acid or pyruvate. We can take those 2 3 carbon units, run the process backwards, and make glucose. That's called gluconeogenesis. So gluco for glucose, neo for new, genesis from the beginning. So I'm going to abbreviate that process GNG as we go forward. So why do we give propylene glycol to animals with ketosis? Anybody done this? Drench, IV. Propylene glycol is a 3 carbon unit. We can use that, cow can use that glycol to make sugar. And with the sugars present, we can burn more fat and we can get rid of that ketosis. So that propylene glycol acts as another of the 3 carbon units to help us make glucose. That's not part of normal metabolism, but it is there as part of our treatment. We'll talk more about that when we get there. So this is metabolism, what you're going to understand before everything is done. So we're going to go through it step by step. So you should have 2 blanks in your handout. Is that right? Did the 2 blanks show up? So if you get too messy or make a mistake, you can always go on to the next one. So this is where we're going to use our colors. So taking a look, this is a diagram of the cow's body. So you've got capillary beds associated with the GI tract. You've got the portal vein is connecting the forestomach with the lower gut. We're going to focus on the ruminant reticulum and the small intestines, SI, small intestine. You got the portal vein that's going to connect or go to the liver. So from there, the liver's gonna drain. We're gonna go back into the vena cava. The inferior vena cava. Going through, everything's gonna feed back to the heart. We get to the heart, we're gonna pump out to the lungs, then back to the heart, and then we're gonna go out the aorta. And the aorta is gonna split off, it's gonna go to the liver, it's gonna go to the gastrointestinal tract, it's gonna go to the fat tissue, adipose, muscle, nervous, or the mammary gland. When we're talking about metabolism here and the metabolites that are going around, you're gonna have the fat tissue, adipose tissue, and the muscle tissue is gonna take stuff in, but it's also gonna export stuff out. Generally, with the nervous tissue and the mammary gland, nutrients are absorbed and used, nothing else comes back out. So you're seeing a circulation going around the board here. And we're going to figure out how all that works. So you've got black ink is what we've started with. Those are pathways and parts. We're going to add green ink for nutrients, blue for pathways, and red ink for hormones where they occur. There won't be too many of those influencing what we're doing. Does everybody understand the layout? So going back to nutrition, in the rumen we have fermentation. We're going to simplify it. We have carbohydrate, CHO. That's a nutrient, so that's ingrained. It goes through a process called fermentation. And through fermentation, we're going to generate our VFAs. You need to move, feel free to do so. So our three VFAs, we have acetate, we have propionate, and butyrate. Acetate's 2 carbons long. Propionate is 3 carbons long. And butyrate is 4 carbons long. So that's simplified fermentation. Those become the building blocks. Those VFAs are building blocks for pretty much everything that a cow uses for energy. So building blocks for carbohydrates, building blocks for fats. So for stomach, the reticulorumen is mostly fermentation. So the blue process there. Any questions about that? So once fermentation is done, we've generated a number of substrates. They're going to be moved from the fermentation vat up front through the abomasum, and digestion is going to occur. We're going to focus on the small intestine. So we've got microbial amino acids, microbial protein that has been generated in the fermentation, moving down. They'll be digested to amino acids. So breaking up the protein to amino acids. The same with the feed protein, broken up into amino acids. We're going to have a certain amount of starch that's going to get by the fermentation. And that is going to be generated or digested into glucose. So starch and glucose are our carbohydrates. We have a protein source. Cow's going to make its living off of microbial protein and feed protein. We'll also have some fats, not a lot, moving through. So fats are gonna go a route here that's a little different. Everything else is gonna go to the liver. Fats are gonna generally bypass the liver and go directly to the vena cava. We won't get into details about how that happens, but they get put into the lymph system, and that lymph system drains into the vena cava just before the heart. So they're gonna bypass the liver. So we've got a series of nutrients, acetate, propionate, butyrate, amino acids from two sources, and glucose that are going to potentially end up in the liver, and then the liver decides what happens to them. Everybody caught up so far? So if we're looking at our butyrate, most of the butyrate does not get to the liver. It's going to be split in half. We got 4 carbons there. It's going to go through fat processing, be split in half, and fed directly to oxidation. Butyrate's going to basically power the gut. That's an oversimplification, but it's good enough for this class. So very little butyrate gets to the liver. Most of it is burned up beforehand. So butyrate as a green nutrient, it's going to go through fat prep, split in half, and then be oxidized in the rumen wall. We've also added up top sort of all the things that are going to leave the aorta. We'll talk more about those in a couple minutes, but if you want to take the time to write them down. So what the various capillary systems dump in, all collected in the vena cava, goes through the heart, the lungs, back to the heart. We're going to have TG is going to be triglycerides. We've got fatty acids floating around in the blood. So those represent the fats. The next line we have, we got acetate up there. 2 carbon units will float around in the blood, be used by various parts of the body. We've got AA equals amino acids. Then we've got proteins floating in the blood that are created by the liver. We've got a lot of glucose. Typical cow is 80 milligrams per deciliter. That would be hypoglycemic for us, but cows seem to do all right. So that glucose produced in the liver, you're also going to move around water as a nutrient, minerals, and vitamins. So those are all the nutrients that are going to be distributed by the aorta, and the various tissues are going to pick up. And then we have, as we said before, GNG equals gluconeogenesis. So that's written at the bottom there. So we said a cow, or I'm proposing that cow is metabolism, its ability to take all these inputs that we have in green up there and create what she needs is a pretty impressive metabolic feat. In the liver, we have full cellular metabolism. So we've got our diagram that we've talked about before: fat prep, glycolysis, protein prep, transition, and oxidation. The liver can do all of that. The liver will also, when it's working properly, and one of the things that when we get an animal that's sick, these processes start to fall away. We're taking our 3 carbon units. So 3 carbons, we talked about the 5 different ones. They're going to go through gluconeogenesis, create glucose, our 6 carbon unit. And those glucoses can be strung together in chains to form glycogen. Remember that from the beginning of the semester? The storage form of glucose in the animal body. So this is a huge function of our dairy cattle liver, being able to produce lactose. Lactose determines milk volume. We don't get paid like we used to on milk volume, the pounds of milk produced each day, but we still use it for bragging rights, right? So Holsteins are a little bit better at producing the amount of lactose every day. That's why they have more pounds of milk. But when you start to look at total pounds of protein output, total pounds of fat output, they tend to equal out. So if I can produce more components in less pounds of milk, what advantage is that to me in the Northeast? It's going to reduce my hauling costs, because my hauling costs are based on pounds, but I get paid on pounds of fat, pounds of protein produced. If I can do the same amount of protein and fat in less pounds, I will have an increased net milk price, because marketing is charged by hundredweight, hauling is charged by hundredweight. So if I can increase what each pound is worth and then get charged for less pounds total, I should come out ahead. And there are a lot of people starting to think about that, especially if they're not trucking their own milk. We have the liver doing a lot of protein synthesis and degradation. So we take proteins that enter into the liver. The liver will break those down into their component amino acids. So DEG, protein degradation. Synthesis, SIN, we've got protein synthesis. So you have the cycle of proteins that are being created or brought in, being broken down into their individual amino acids, and that pool is used to create new proteins as the liver decides they're necessary. Both of those protein and amino acids will be exported from the liver, and they'll end up in the nutrient pool at the aorta. We also have synthesis of amino acids. The liver synthesizes all non-essential amino acids. So it will create amino acids to put into that pool. And that pool can use to be able to create protein. So the liver's got a pool of amino acids to work from. Some of them are going to come from liver synthesis. Some of them are going to come from the diet to create the proteins that the cow needs. So if liver function is compromised by a fatty liver situation, we're going to lose metabolism, the ability to create energy to run processes. We're going to lose gluconeogenesis. And we're going to lose protein synthesis and degradation. We lose those things, the cow is compromised, she's in trouble. The question, where does acetate go? So there are two fates of acetate after it's absorbed. Goes through the portal vein. One is it bypasses the liver and ends up into the vena cava. It becomes one of the nutrients that the rest of the body can use. Or it can be burned. 2-carbon unit goes directly into oxidation, burned for energy in the liver. So producing the ATP that the liver needs to do all of these processes. So the ATP moves over to protein synthesis, moves over to help with gluconeogenesis. So taking those two arrows out to keep things a little clearer, all of the propionate that's absorbed is going to be turned into glucose. Some of it might be burned, but for this class, let's just say all that propionate ends up in glucose. So there's a whole lot of propionate going into the liver, almost none leaving the liver. There's almost no glucose going into the liver, but there's a whole lot leaving the liver. So that propionate goes to glucose. So acetate can be either burned or bypass the liver. Propionate's made into glucose. Butyrate never gets there. Be burned up in the metabolism of the gut to power all those contractions to keep that mixing going. So one goes from acetate to oxidation. So it's a 2-carbon unit already, feeds directly into oxidation, turned into 17 ATP. Two of them give you that 34, 36, 38, somewhere in there. The other is it goes through the liver and then is exported untouched, flows out of the liver back to the heart, becomes part of the nutrient pool that the rest of the body has to work with. Everybody following so far? So propionate, all of it goes to glucose. When we're looking at amino acids, they're going to be absorbed in the small intestine and go over into the amino acid pool of the liver. So our liver can make protein from stuff it synthesizes, and the amino acids, whether they're microbial or feed protein, that are absorbed. Doesn't matter where the amino acids come from, we need them to get the job done. Alanine, if it's absorbed, can go and become glucose if we're in that desperate need of glucose. So that's one of the 20 amino acids that would be absorbed from the gut. That one in particular could go to gluconeogenesis if we needed it to. So we know what happens to each of the VFAs. We know what happens to the amino acids. I think next up is the starch or glucose. Glucose, we break down the starch in rumen or the small intestine. We have glucose free in the small intestine. Generally, when it's absorbed, the small intestine will run it through glycolysis. What benefit is that to the small intestine? What happens in glycolysis that the small intestinal lining could benefit from? Not yet, no. What happens in glycolysis as a process? Anybody remember? Not the triglyceride, we're talking about glucose. What, you got a 6 carbon at the top of glycolysis, what do you got at the bottom? After transition, you got the 2 carbon. At the bottom of glycolysis, you got a 3 carbon called pyruvate. What happens along the way? Does glycolysis generate ATP? Yes, so they're using glycolysis to generate ATP to run the lining of the gut. Pyruvate is toxic to the cell. If we're not going to burn it all the way down, we convert it to lactate, that other 3 carbon unit. That lactate goes on to the liver, and then from the ATP generated in the liver, we can recreate glucose. So it's a way for the gut to pull out a little ATP, send the product down the line. The liver will recreate that glucose. So most of the glucose that is absorbed by the tissues doesn't leave to the portal vein as glucose. It's split apart into lactate and then recreated into glucose in the gut. So if we're looking at our units coming in, 3 carbon units. We've got lactate going in. We've got alanine going in. We've got propionate going in. We can steal a glycerol going in. Or we can steal from pyruvate. So those are our 5 3 carbon units that we can use to make glucose. Lactate, alanine, propionate, glycerol, and pyruvate. Everybody see where those 5 3 carbon units come from to make glucose. So pyruvate at the end of glycolysis, lactate from the gut, and also we'll show you from the muscles in next class. So that'll be next Tuesday. Alanine. You could also steal alanine from the pool over here, but that seems kind of silly to make it and then destroy it again. Propionate, that's our big creator of lactose. So 2 propionates make a glucose, 2 glucoses make a lactose. So how many propionates do we need? 2 and 2 make 2 glucoses. 2 glucoses make 1 lactose. So we'll go over that in more detail when we get into what happens in here. This is what we care about. Anybody need more time? Everybody with me so far? 1 lactose. Don't confuse lactate and lactose. Lactic acid is a 3-carbon unit. Lactose is a disaccharide that's got 12 carbons in it. So if you think about it, in order to get 12 carbons with 3 carbon units, I need 4 of them. So bringing everything together, showing what's leaving the liver. So we're bringing back the acetate curves, the amino acid curves. So you're going to have acetate leaving the liver. You're going to have glucose leaving the liver. And then amino acids, protein, and urea. So as things are degraded, we can generate ammonia. That ammonia must be quickly turned into urea, or we're going to run into toxic effects in the body with the ammonia. So 2 ammonias are stuck to carbon. That's urea. So taking this goes over here. That's how we detoxify that ammonia. So what leaves the liver is what the cow more or less has to work with. Water is going to pass through the liver largely untouched. Minerals are going to pass through the liver largely untouched. Vitamins are going to pass through the liver largely untouched. So they're going to be absorbed through the portal vein and work their way through. So that gives us our pool up top. We got some fat sources, we got amino acids and protein, we got glucose, we got water, minerals and vitamins that the other tissues of the body, the fat, the muscle, the nervous system, and the mammary gland can work with. So let's look at the adipose tissue. So when I went through nutrition, Dr. Warner talked about adipose tissue being a tub full of frogs. It's constantly turning over. It's constantly creating triglycerides and breaking them down. So of the nutrients available in there, we're taking glucose and acetate. And we're going to use those to make triglycerides. So we take acetate, glucose, we go through lipogenesis, and we make the triglycerides that are then stored in that tissue. We can start to break those down through a process called lipolysis. The way I was taught about lipolysis is Dr. Warner goes, well, we'll explain that first after we get done with the test. And everybody looked around and goes, what test? So he just announced a test, and unfortunately, the guys that lived on my dorm started screaming at me. Well, not screaming, but that harsh whisper. You didn't tell us about a test, because they had missed the previous classes and I hadn't. And I was like, I don't know anything about it. So they're freaking out about the test. That's going to lead to an adrenaline response that's going to start lipolysis. So epinephrine, released from the adrenal glands, is a hormone that will promote the breakdown of fat, so we can start to use it for energy. So how do we get fat? We take glucose, we'll split that in half, make 2 glycerols. So we've got 6 carbon, 3 carbons each. That's going to go to our triglyceride. That top part where we hang everything off, right? Acetates are going to be strung together to make fatty acids. So acetate is 2 carbons. Fatty acids generally have an even number of carbons. 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. And that's because of the way they're made. We take acetate, 2 carbon units, we string them together. We make our fatty acids. Then our fatty acids become part of the triglyceride. So string them together. This is like glycolysis. It's like string. String together. Everybody see how that happens. We'll spend more time on that when we get to the mammary gland, but that's how we take the basic building blocks of glucose and acetate and make triglyceride in our cows. Now, if you're a pig, you're going to do that a whole lot in your liver. Cows don't like fat in their liver. So things related to fat tend to be done outside. Most of the fat manufacture in cows is in the adipose tissue or the mammary gland. Liver does very little in ruminants, whereas us humans or pigs or birds, the liver will do a lot of that. So if we need to move that energy, particularly in early lactation, to another part of the body, triglycerides and fatty acids are exported and put in carriers that are proteins with the hydrophilic outside, hydrophobic inside. So we mentioned HDL, LDL, VLDL are the carriers, and they're going to move it around the body to wherever that fat or energy is needed. How we doing so far? Everybody following what we're talking about so far? So next time we'll talk about muscle, nervous tissue, and then we'll talk about some maladies and then move into the mammary gland. So bring that handout again next time. Take it from there.